The first snow hadn't yet fallen when the laughter started. It came low and casual at first, from the mouths of neighbors passing by in wagons or murmured over whiskey glasses at dusk. But by the second week of November, the ridicule turned sharp. They called her Crazy Edna, the rock floor lady, the one who's begging to freeze. No one asked why she'd done it. No one wanted to understand. The mountains had their way of making you look foolish before they made you smart, and Edna Slocum had already lost too much to care what foolish looked like. The widow had built her cabin up Hollow Ridge just past the old burnt cottonwood, a good half day from the rest of the town. Folks said no woman had any business building a place that far out. But when she started lining the floor with smooth river stones, wide, flat pieces she'd hauled back herself in a cart, it gave the town a new reason to whisper. They said she was wasting her strength, that no rock floor could keep in heat, that come winter it'd chill her from the bones up. Her neighbors were all laying down plank, tightly sealed with pine pitch. Meanwhile, Edna was laying rocks, rows and rows of them, polished smooth with weeks of hand scrubbing. They mocked her when she set them down like puzzle pieces. They mocked her harder when she sealed them with clay. But the truth was, Edna hadn't done it for pride, nor out of ignorance. She'd done it for Samuel. He was barely 5 and already coughing by the time the chimney went up. His little body had grown thin after the spring fever took his strength, and the last winter back east had nearly ended him. Edna still heard that wheeze in her sleep, tight, rasping, wet. She'd buried one child already when her husband passed, and the Lord himself would have to walk through fire before she'd let another slip from her arms. That floor was built for Samuel. She had no man to chop wood for her through the season, and she knew she couldn't keep a stove hot day and night with a boy that sick and weak. The floor had to hold warmth. It had to store it. Edna had read once, long ago, something in a borrowed book about Roman floors and ancient dwellings. She barely remembered the words. Thermal mass, maybe? But she remembered the image. Stone soaked up the day's heat and let it go slow at night, like coals buried under ash. That was all she'd needed to believe. So she built it, not because it was the smart choice or the easy one, but because it was the only one. The cabin was modest, a single room with thick log walls, a loft above for storage and sleeping. The windows were few and small, and she'd stuffed moss around every edge. But the floor, that was her labor. First, she dug it shallow and wide, hauling out soil until the rectangle was flat. Then came the crushed gravel, pounded hard, and then the wide stones, each one laid slow, a rhythm of scraping and setting, kneeling and lifting. In between, she packed red, clay mixed with ash and straw. Her knees turned raw, her fingers cracked. But by the end of October, the whole surface gleamed. By then, the laughter had turned meaner. The Wilkinsons rode by and hollered from their buggy that she was just decorating her tomb. The men at the general store called her Widow Rocks behind her back. When she came to buy beans or lard, they'd ask if she was planning to tile the roof next too. Edna never responded. She kept her eyes low and let the mockery pass. She'd known hard stares since her husband died. She was too used to silence to trade it for shame. Only 2 people had stepped inside her cabin that fall. Old Man Clegg, who'd helped her roll one of the bigger stones from the riverbank, and Eliza Boone, the schoolteacher, who'd brought over a loaf of cornbread and stood barefoot on the floor with an unreadable look. "It holds the sun," Eliza whispered. "It feels warm already." "It does," Edna had said simply. "That's the point." But Eliza never repeated that. She never defended Edna either. And when the first blizzard hit, sudden, early and sharp, no one was thinking about floors. They were too busy chopping, hauling, and stuffing blankets under doors. It came down hard in the 3rd week of November, locking the valley in white for 5 days straight. Woodpiles shrank. Fires ate through them like paper. Chimneys puffed black smoke into a gray, wind-bit sky. And halfway up Hollow Ridge, Edna sat on her rock floor with Samuel wrapped in quilts, a kettle of stew bubbling slowly. No fire lit, because the floor was still warm. She had lit the stove for 2 hours the morning before the storm. That was all. The rocks had soaked in the heat. That night, she laid down blankets across them, and by dawn, the warmth still rose through the wool like a ghost from summer. Samuel's hands were toasty, his cheeks pink, his cough was quieter. She lit no fire that day, or the next, and still the rocks glowed with comfort, not blazing heat, just warmth, enough to ease bone and breath, enough to sleep without shivering. On the 3rd day, a knock came at her door. Edna froze. No one visited this high during storm weeks. She opened the door slowly, and there stood Eliza Boone, blue-lipped and teeth chattering. "Stove won't keep up," the teacher said. "We can't keep the children warm." Edna stepped aside without a word. Eliza crossed the threshold and then paused. Her eyes dropped to the stones. Her breath fogged in the cold air, then stilled. She looked down in disbelief. "It's warm," she said again. "Edna? Your floor is warm." "I know," Edna answered. Samuel peeked from under a blanket and waved. Eliza started to cry. That night, 3 more children arrived, Eliza's pupils. She brought them bundled, half frozen. They slept with Samuel and Edna on the stone floor, tucked like peas in a pod across wool layers and patched quilts. The rocks held them. By morning, word had traveled. The next day, a man came, James Dwyer, whose chimney flue had cracked. His wife and baby had turned pale blue by morning. He begged for shelter. Edna let them in. Then came the Wilkinsons. Then came 2 ranch hands. Then, astonishingly, came Old Man Clegg, who'd never asked for a thing in his life. By the end of the week, 10 people were sleeping across Edna's useless rock floor, and it was still warm. Neighbors began asking questions. How'd she do it? What did she use? How deep was it? Could she come show them? She said no. She stayed home. She watched over the children, tended the stew pot, kept the quilts fluffed and the air calm. She lit a fire once every 2 days, just enough to refresh the floor. And slowly the talk changed. By the time the first thaw came in January, they weren't calling her Crazy Edna anymore. They were calling her the Warm Widow. And some of those same men who'd laughed, they started prying up their pine floors. But Edna never offered instructions, because she hadn't built the floor for them. She'd built it for Samuel, and he was breathing easy now. After the thaw, they came bearing apologies. Not the kind a man says straight to a woman's face, not in those hills, not in that century, but the kind spoken in lowered eyes, slower greetings, the silence of a man offering a bag of flour without asking for coin. James Dwyer chopped 2 cords of wood for her that March, stacked them neat, and left before she could say thank you. The Wilkinson boys brought a goose, still warm from the pluck. Eliza stayed late one evening scrubbing pans, not saying a word. It wasn't charity, it was tribute. Edna accepted each gift without a smile or a nod, not because she was ungrateful, because she knew what it had cost them. Still, no one talked about the floor, not in public anyway. No one admitted they'd spent the worst nights of the blizzard on it, or that their children had slept through freezing nights because of it. That sort of thing didn't make it to Sunday conversations or trading post gossip. You didn't boast that you'd been saved by a widow's clay and stone, no matter how warm it had been. But that spring, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just questions, always asked sideways. What kind of clay was it exactly? You said you packed it under the stones, or over them? How thick did you lay that gravel base? You let the sun hit it direct through the windows, or kept it shaded? Edna always answered the same way. It wasn't just one thing, and that frustrated them more than silence. Then came the visitors, men who hadn't said a word to her in years. Ranchers, carpenters, and one sawmill operator dropping by just to say hello. But each of them stared at the floor, lingered at the threshold, studied the edges where stone met wall. One even had the gall to crouch and press his palm to it. Still warm, he muttered as if surprised. Even now, it holds the sun, Edna replied softly. They stopped laughing about that floor by May, but it wasn't until summer came that the second miracle happened. It had been a dry heat, long days of dust and brittle leaves. Most cabins became ovens by late afternoon, but Edna's stayed steady. Cool in the mornings, tolerable by noon, never stifling by supper. The stones, warmed only gently through the day, absorbed heat slowly and never let it spike. Eliza, who visited often now with a basket of hand-mended linens, noted it one afternoon with a tone of disbelief. "Feels like walking into a cave," she said. "Cool and even, my own floors near burned my toes." "You can lay cool on stone," Edna replied. "It listens." Eliza laughed like that was poetry, but she remembered the words. She repeated them later to the school board, then to the preacher. Soon the phrase echoed across porches and among traders at the general store. You'd hear it used like a saying folks had always known: stone listens. They never gave Edna credit, but they started believing it. By fall, 3 new cabins had stone floors. They weren't like hers. They were rough-laid, uneven, set with whatever could be pried from the creekside. They cracked in cold or shifted under frost. One man tried to set his without a gravel base, and the spring rains turned his parlor to mud. They came back to Edna, not to mock, to ask, truly ask. How'd you do it? Why clay, not pitch? What kept it from shifting? How do you clean it? How long did it stay warm exactly? This time she gave them more. Crushed rock first, tamped hard. Flat stone over it, laid tight. Clay sealed with ash. Needs to breathe, but not move. Needs to breathe? One man repeated. Like lungs, she said. Tighten it too much. You strangle it. Leave it too loose. It loses heat. The men stood quiet. Some took notes. Some cursed under their breath. Still others just shook their heads, like they'd never understand her kind. By October, 10 homes in the valley had torn up their pine floors and begun anew. The preacher's own house, largest in town, had its entire dining room stripped bare for the project. And it was around then, just before the frost came back, that the question began to rise. Could she teach it? A few voices began murmuring that Edna should write it out, pass the knowledge. One bold soul even suggested she teach a class at the schoolhouse. She could spare the time, someone said. It's not like she's got young ones anymore. Samuel had turned 6 that September. He was strong now. His hair had filled in thick. His cough had disappeared. His cheeks were apple red, and he no longer woke in cold sweat or wheezed through the nights. He ran. He climbed. He shouted too loud and kicked too hard. He had been in every measure returned to her. When folks praised his recovery, they credited stew or mountain air or God. No one said floor. Edna didn't offer it either. But one evening, as the fire danced low and Samuel was curled in her lap, she did whisper something aloud, half to herself, half to the stones beneath them. "I owe you," she said. "You brought him through." The rocks didn't answer, but their warmth spread steady up her legs. That night, Eliza returned with a question. "The schoolhouse floor's sagging," she said, "and the roof leaks, but the board has set money aside to fix the place up. I told them about your method." "I never meant it to be a method," Edna replied. "But it works," Eliza said. "The children freeze through half the school year. You've made something brilliant. You could help so many." Edna stayed silent. Samuel stirred in her lap. "I just want a warm place for him," she said finally. "Not a sermon, not a school." Eliza nodded. She didn't press her, but the seed had been planted. That winter came harder than the last. Thicker snow, sharper winds, 2 late blizzards that crushed roofs and drowned cattle. But through it all, the floor held. Her cabin stayed warm. And this time, the visitors arrived before the storm. By December 5th, she'd taken in 15. They brought their own quilts now, their own kettles, their own firewood. They knew the routine. They slept in shifts, kept the floor bare during the day, warmed it by stove at dusk. Edna didn't need to explain it anymore. They obeyed the stones. But something else had shifted too. They no longer mocked her. They looked at her with something like reverence, something bordering on fear. It wasn't just that the floor worked. It was that only hers worked. The preacher's stones had cracked. The Wilkinsons turned brittle. The Boones complained theirs never warmed more than bare dirt. Others found their cabins holding heat poorly or chilling too fast. Some floors grew slick with frost. Others lifted and shifted with soil. But Edna's remained perfect. That's when the talk turned darker. Some said it was the location. Others said it was the clay. But one man muttered too loud after church that it had to be witchcraft. "Rocks don't warm a house like that," he said. "Not on their own." That word, witch, carried weight. Not like Salem weight, not burn at the stake weight, but enough to twist a town's mood. Enough to remind people that Edna wasn't quite one of them. Not anymore. Still they came. Still they brought children. Still they laid themselves across the stones. Because warmth is stronger than fear. But Edna heard the whispers return. This time, colder than before. This time, laced with envy. And Samuel had begun asking why no other floor felt like theirs. Why the stones at the Boone house were always cold. Why the preacher's floor cracked underfoot. "What makes ours different?" he asked. Edna didn't know how to answer. She only knew what she'd done. But one night, after everyone had eaten, she stood barefoot in the center of the room, staring down. She crouched, pressed her palm flat, felt the deep, slow warmth that hadn't faded in 3 winters. And she began to wonder, not about sorcery, not about spirits, but about memory, about whether a floor could remember fire, whether stone could hold not just heat, but the purpose behind it, the why behind the labor. And if that were true, if a floor could remember love or need or desperation, then maybe that's what no other floor had. Maybe that's why theirs worked, because it had been made by a mother who couldn't afford to fail. And that kind of heat, that kind of love, lasted. It was sometime around the 3rd winter, after Samuel's 7th birthday. After 2 more storms had blacked out the valley, after yet another family had dragged a sick baby up Hollow Ridge in the middle of a sleet wind, that Edna Slocum realized she no longer lived in a cabin. She lived in a refuge. It was no longer just a home, no longer a space she'd carved for herself and her son. It had become something larger, something people whispered about while clinging to wool, something they remembered the way a parched man remembers the taste of water. It had become a place of proof, a standing contradiction to everything they'd ever believed about what a widow could build, what warmth could be made from stone, and what desperation could teach. And yet, despite everything, Edna still lived quietly, still worked alone, still scrubbed the same copper pot every morning, still laid out Samuel's clothes beside the stove before sunrise, still ran her fingers along the stone seams as if checking for a heartbeat. Only now, every quiet hour was interrupted by the sound of need. Someone always came. By late November of that 3rd winter, the line had grown so predictable she began leaving out a second stew pot at all times. Word had spread far beyond their valley. Now, into the hill passes, through snow-battered mining camps, across river towns with sagging porch posts and soot-choked chimneys. There were whispers about a cabin that didn't need a fire every day, about a floor that warmed you from the bottom up, about a widow who had unlocked something secret. And that winter they started arriving in wagons. Some came respectfully, with offerings, baskets of root vegetables, rusted tools, home-churned butter. Others came with nothing but red noses and shivering limbs. One man came with a wrapped infant and frostbite on his toes. Another brought his horse inside the entryway, begging to let it stand near warmth just for one night. A woman, her fingers cracked and her eyes hollow, stood silent in the doorway until Edna simply opened her arms. "Come lie down," Edna said. The woman wept, not from gratitude, from release. By December's end, there were over 20 sleeping in shifts on that stone floor. They laid out coats and canvas, tarps and threadbare blankets, and took turns tending the stove. They whispered among themselves about the heat rising through the wool, the way it seemed to breathe with them, like sleeping on the earth's chest. And still, not one of them fully understood how it worked. One evening, as sleet crackled against the windows and the wind howled down through the pines, a man named Merrick, thin, clever, a tinker by trade, sat cross-legged beside the hearth, running his hands over the stone like a priest reading scripture. "This is some old-world trick," he said to no one in particular. "Roman, maybe? Or before? I've never felt anything like it." Edna was beside him, stirring broth. "It's not a trick," she said simply. He glanced at her sideways. "Then it's magic." "No," she said. "It's need." She offered nothing more. Merrick never stopped watching the floor. By January, something new began to happen. They started taking notes. Several of the guests, especially the younger men and women, brought scraps of paper and pencils from the schoolhouse. They traced the seams in the stone, sketched the angles, measured widths and depths and clay thickness. They pressed palms against different sections and scribbled temperatures in the margins. Some argued about the layering, others drew diagrams. Eliza, visiting more often now, read aloud from borrowed books on ancient dwellings, rattling off phrases like radiant conduction and passive retention, but none of them could replicate it. They tried. Dozens began laying their own stone floors in barns, back rooms, chicken sheds, even in cellars carved into hillsides. But the results were uneven. Some cracked, others turned slick with moisture. One cabin near Dead Branch Creek flooded during a thaw and washed out half the stonework. Another collapsed inward from shifting soil. No floor kept warmth like Edna's, not even close. The murmurs returned, this time more urgent, more suspicious. Some said it had to be the soil under her home, rich in something strange. Others claimed she'd used a secret mixture, some blend of clay and ash that she refused to share. A few insisted she must have buried coals beneath it. One man proposed, half in jest and half in menace, that she'd entombed something living under the stones. Eliza defended her in town, so did old man Clegg, who had grown frail now and mostly watched from his porch. But it wasn't enough to stop what came next. Late January brought a new visitor, not a neighbor, not a widow or a carpenter, a man from the rail towns. He wore a thick coat of boiled leather and carried a polished cane, though he clearly didn't limp. He arrived in a covered sled drawn by 2 mules and introduced himself with a stiff smile. "Mr. Harlan Shute," he said, tipping his cap. "I represent certain parties interested in alternative heating solutions." Edna said nothing. "I've heard of your success here," he continued, "and I'd like to offer a proposal." She raised an eyebrow but still didn't invite him in. He cleared his throat. "We'd like to examine your floor, perhaps bring in some engineers. In exchange, we'd compensate you. Quite well, I think." Behind him, Samuel had stepped into the doorway. He was taller now, lean with a quickness to his eyes. He frowned at the stranger. "What for?" Samuel asked. "To learn," Harlan said. "To share this gift with the world." "It's not a gift," Edna said quietly. "It's a grave." Harlan blinked. "I beg your pardon?" She stared past him, out into the white fields, where the wind bit low and mean across the ridge. "I buried every mistake in that floor," she said. "Every hour I cried into the clay, every scream I gave when Samuel couldn't breathe. I made those rocks hot with desperation. You think you can bottle that?" "I think," Harlan said gently, "that you've done something extraordinary, and the world could use it." "It wasn't built for the world," she replied. "It was built for one boy." He didn't argue, just nodded once and left his card on the porch rail. It was stamped with a gold emblem, Midwestern Thermal Innovations. She burned it in the stove that night. But something had changed. That visit brought others, men in coats, women with notebooks. They started arriving in pairs, surveyors, inspectors, map makers. They sketched the slope of the hill, traced water drainage lines, asked to see beneath the cabin. They offered money, they offered fame, they offered publication in Eastern journals. One offered a patent. Edna refused each one, firm, polite. Then the threats came. Not loud, not direct, just missing mail, bent nails in the road, a rock thrown through the window one evening when Samuel was reading by lamplight. You can't hide genius forever, someone carved into her front step. So she hid the stones. It wasn't hard. She laid down. Thick wool rugs over the seams, stacked her quilts in the corners, kept the room dim. She stopped taking guests. When the blizzard hit in February, she barred the door. The valley was furious. People called her selfish, ungrateful, said she owed it to the town, to the children, to the future. But Edna didn't answer. She sat in silence, Samuel by her side, and the stones beneath them, warm as ever. You did the right thing, Samuel said softly one night. She nodded but didn't speak, because she wasn't sure anymore. Not about the floor, but about people. They'd come first with laughter, then with desperation, then with greed, and soon they would come with shovels. The winter ended late that year. It clawed into April like a beast reluctant to die. The snow took longer to melt from Hollow Ridge than anywhere else, turning the paths to Edna's cabin into heavy mud, rutted and slow. But the slowness didn't stop them. By the first thaw, the visitors returned, not with shivering children this time, but with notebooks, contracts, measuring sticks. One man even brought a camera from the east, awkward and box-shaped, requiring 10 minutes just to set up a shot. They didn't ask if they could come inside anymore. They came expecting, but Edna's door stayed shut. She posted no signs, made no declarations, just kept the curtains drawn, the rugs laid thick, the fire low, the routine steady. For weeks, she didn't venture down to town, sent Samuel only once, with a sled and a list, and even then, someone tried to follow him back. He caught it before the turnoff trail, heard the crunch of deliberate boots in the brush behind him. He paused, pretended to tie a bootlace, and then slung a stone, just like his mother had taught him, clean across the trail, not hitting, but near enough to warn. The steps stopped, then turned. By the time he got home, his face was pink with cold and breathless fury. They don't want to learn, he said. They want to steal. Edna took his hands between hers, warmed his fingers, and said nothing. But that night, she opened the trap beneath the floor, the hidden one, shallow, dry, sealed tight under 2 stones near the corner. From it she pulled the old notes. They were stained, crumpled, yellowed with years. Not plans exactly. Edna had never needed diagrams, but records of the weight of each stone, the mix of each clay batch, the exact hours she'd kept the coals going during construction, how long it took the gravel base to settle, the days she'd sobbed so hard laying the final seam she nearly quit, and the one sheet where she'd written, in scratchy charcoal, "If this works, it was never the stone, it was me." She stared at that page a long time. Then she burned it in the stove, because that was what they would never understand. What Merrick and Eliza and Harlan Shute and all the rest of them could never put in a pamphlet or a patent, that the floor worked because she had no other choice. It wasn't a clever idea. It was survival. It was grief made useful, love made stubborn. And when they came back again, 4 of them this time, men from the rail line dressed in neat wool and thick boots, one with a drawing tube under his arm, Edna finally stepped out to meet them, not with her hair tied, not with her hands clasped, not with softness. She stood on the porch in her work apron, with soot on her cheek and the wind flattening her skirt against her knees, and she looked them each in the eyes. "We're prepared to offer land," one said. "We'd pay for your time," another added. "We want to replicate the process. We'll keep your name on it." She let them speak, let the offers pile like snowdrifts, and when they finished, she tilted her head slightly. "Has anyone built one that works?" They hesitated. "Well," one said, "not quite like yours." "Then you didn't copy it," she said. "You missed it." The wind hissed behind her. "I laid that floor with grief in my gut and a half-dead child coughing on a cot beside me. I sang to the stones while my hands bled from scraping them clean. I packed clay with ash from a fire my husband built before he died. And every part of that floor knows me." She leaned forward, voice steady. "You don't want a heating system. You want proof you can take a shortcut, that you can have what I built without having to live what I lived." They tried to protest, of course, talk of science, talk of data. She cut them off. "Go home, build what you want. I've told you enough." She turned, stepped inside, and closed the door. She didn't have to bolt it. None of them followed. But the next morning, someone had carved the word witch into her fence rail. Edna saw it when she went out for firewood. She stared at it for a moment, just stared, then took her hand axe, split the plank, and threw it in the fire. She didn't tell Samuel, but she began watching the woods. Again, carefully. That spring, Samuel asked to visit town more often. He'd grown taller still, voice deepening at the edges, more independent now. He no longer asked if he could stay up late or wander past the ridge. He brought back books when he went. History, construction, science, stacked high in the sled or under one arm. And each night he read aloud while Edna mended clothes or ground dried corn or skimmed the top of a stew. He read about ancient Roman baths, about Pueblo kivas, about Korean ondol floors and Finnish saunas, about clay, stone, heat transfer. People did this before, he said one night, excited. Centuries ago, maybe not exactly like us, but they understood. Edna smiled. And how many of them had to protect it? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew, because by then things had begun to go missing. First it was a bucket from the porch, then a coil of rope, then a set of fire irons from beside the stove, gone when they came back. From a walk down to the creek, there were boot tracks in the dirt. Not hers, not Samuel's. Someone had tried to pry open the woodshed. Someone else had dug beside the chimney foundation, looking for who knew what. Then one morning, the entire trapdoor panel beneath the corner rugs was missing. Lifted clean out, the clay around it disturbed. But nothing had been taken. Whoever came hadn't known what they were looking for, and now they knew she was hiding something. That afternoon, Edna sent Samuel to town with a sealed letter. He returned with Eliza. The teacher stood in the doorway, silent for a long time. "I knew it would come to this," she said finally. Edna nodded. "We don't want it to get ugly." "But it will?" "Yes." And the next week the sheriff came. He arrived without a warrant, without uniform, just a coat and a look of practiced concern. "Edna," he said, "there's folks in town worried you're keeping something dangerous here." She didn't blink. "Dangerous like a stove? They say you've built something unnatural." "It's a flaw, Aaron. They say it listens. It listens like stone always has." He rubbed his temples. "You need to let people in. Show them there's nothing hidden." She folded her arms. "I've shown them more than they deserved. You're causing unrest. I caused warmth. The unrest is theirs." He looked tired, older than she remembered. "I don't want this to become something it isn't," he said. "It already is," she replied. He left without another word, and that night she laid bricks across the door from the inside. Just one layer, just enough to pause anyone foolish. Samuel helped. Neither of them spoke while doing it. The snow returned that May, a freak storm, late and savage. A last bite from a winter that wouldn't let go. Wind ripped branches from pine, coated hills in ice, roofs collapsed, chickens froze solid in roosts, and once again, people came knocking. Edna didn't open, not the first night, not the second, but on the third, when she heard a child's voice, thin, panicked, coughing hard, she stepped over the bricks and unbolted the door. It was Merrick, the tinker. He had his niece in his arms. Her face was grey. "We tried," he said. "We tried to build it like you said, but the stones cracked. The firewood ran out." Edna said nothing, just stepped aside. The child lived. Her color returned by dawn. The floor had been lit only twice that week. Edna walked the perimeter of the cabin that morning, checked every seam, every vent, every window. Then she went inside and sealed the trapdoor permanently, stone over it, mortared with ash and lime. Samuel watched. "You sure?" She looked at him, her son, nearly grown now, standing taller than she remembered. "She's warm now," Edna said. "She doesn't need to be understood. She just needs to be left alone." And she meant the floor, or the cabin, or maybe herself. The bricks stayed in the doorway until the frost finally broke. By then, the snow that had buried the valley in May had melted into long, greedy rivers of mud. Paths vanished, cellars flooded, chickens wandered loose from drowned coops. The entire hillside sagged under the weight of too much water and not enough sun. But Edna's cabin held, as always, and the floor remained warm, not hot, not radiant, but that deep, old warmth, like a memory you don't know you carry until something stirs it. The warmth of hands that once lifted you, of a fire you didn't see lit, but woke beside, breathing easier. It was the warmth of intention, of care pressed deep into every seam. Still, she took no new guests. Word had spread of the closed door. Some said she'd lost her mind, others that she'd built something unnatural and had sealed it to keep the wrong people from discovering it. But most agreed now, whether they called her genius, witch, recluse, or savior, that the floor was real, and that no one else had ever made another quite like it. The reverence came late, but it came all the same. By summer, a letter arrived, carried by a rider from the west and sealed with embossed wax. It came from a university, though Edna couldn't remember which one. Samuel read it aloud on the porch as the wind tugged through the high grass. They wanted to study her, not just the floor, but her thinking, her process, her architectural intuition. They offered an honorary position, travel funds, a place to lecture. They said they could build a replica under her direction. Edna let him finish the letter. Then she reached out, gently took the paper from his hand and folded it once, then again, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. "You're not going?" he asked. She shook her head. "Why not?" "Because they don't need me," she said. "They need the part of me that suffered, and I've given enough of her away." "Already?" He didn't push, because he understood, more than anyone. He remembered the nights she'd held his ribs while he coughed, whispering not prayers but promises. He remembered the hours she spent smoothing the stones, weeping quietly when she thought he was asleep. He remembered the first time he realized that the floor felt alive, not in a way that spoke, but in a way that answered. He remembered what it had cost, and maybe that's why Samuel did what he did next. He built a second floor, not in the same way, not with the same stones, but with care and slowness and silence. He gathered granite from the western stream, heavier and rougher than hers, but steady. He sifted gravel until his shoulders ached, mixed clay not from the upper banks, but from the deposits behind the hollow where moss grew thickest. He built it 1 square yard at a time, in a clearing 20 paces from the original cabin, and he didn't tell his mother until it was done. When she saw it, one late evening after supper, when he led her out with no explanation, she didn't speak for a long time, just walked slowly across it in bare feet, testing each seam, each stone. Finally, she looked at him. "You didn't copy it." He shook his head. "I didn't try to," she smiled. And then, for the first time in years, she knelt, hands on the ground, pressed flat, listened. It wasn't warm yet, not fully, but it would be. It had been built for the right reason. That night they sat by the fire, and Edna told him something she'd never said aloud before. "Back when I built it," she said, "I wasn't just trying to keep you warm. I was trying to undo something. I thought maybe if I made it just right, I could fix what was taken. The baby, your father, the way everything had splintered." He didn't interrupt, just listened. "But that's not how it works," she continued. "You can't undo the cold. You can only build against it. You can only meet it with something stubborn." He nodded. "Like a flaw," she smiled. Exactly. They didn't talk about legacy or wisdom or blueprints, because none of it needed explaining. The stone, after all, already knew. The years passed. Edna didn't move. She didn't lecture. She didn't write a book. But the legend grew. People stopped carving witch on her fence. They started calling her the Stone Mother. She never asked who coined it. She never cared. Cabins rose across the region with crude stone floors. Some failed. Others worked well enough. But none like hers. None ever glowed the way hers did at night, faint through the quilts, like old embers in the blood of the earth. Samuel stayed. He built a wife's house beside the second floor, had children of his own, raised them to sweep the stones gently, to lay wool down at dusk, to light the stove only when the clay felt thirsty. And one day, when Edna was old, and her fingers had gone too stiff to knit, and her steps too short for the ridge trail, she asked for one final thing. "Carry me to the floor," she said. Samuel did. She lay there a long while, hands folded across her belly, eyes open, staring up at the rafters she'd raised alone. Then she whispered, "Still warm," and closed her eyes. She didn't wake. They didn't bury her in the ground. They laid her in the cabin, beneath a new layer of stone, under the same seam she'd once wept across, where Samuel had first slept through a full night without coughing. They sealed it with clay and ash. They laid quilts above it. And in the years that followed, her great-grandchildren would sit there and press their palms flat and whisper, "Still warm." They never understood how. They just knew that when the wind came screaming down the ridge, and the pines bowed under frost, and the world turned silver with ice, the cabin never went cold, because the widow's floor, mocked, doubted, feared, had become something more than invention. It had become memory, and memory, when laid right, holds heat longer than stone ever could.